So it's really what I'm hearing here, what you say is like, and you've kind of touched on it upon before around the origins of our shadow is there's actually much younger elements of our psyche. You know, you talked about the little boy who might be, 7, 8, 9 years old. For a lot of people, they hear that and go, "Oh no, but like I'm a full adult. All of me is an adult." But I'd love you to go into a bit more depth there, actually, because before I say anything, I'll just let you go into a bit more depth about that.
The phrase I come back to repeatedly is that we all mature biologically, but sometimes get frozen psychologically or emotionally. And in a practical sense, what I mean by that is the boy who's told at 6 years old that boys don't cry finds ways of shutting down their grief. So there's kind of two things that happen. There's a somatic piece. So there's a body-based piece where we learn that when the sensations of sadness come up, we tense our body, we stop breathing, and we close off our throat. So sound, movement, and breath shuts down. Our body almost becomes trapped in that posture, and we build our bodies around the holding patterns. So this is the body-based piece. And then the psyche, in all its genius, says, when I cried, it wasn't safe. And so I'm going to find a way of protecting that vulnerability by becoming somebody that can protect that part. So I become an overachiever, and then that protects that part of me. So you've kind of got two pieces there. And then that part is frozen in the background. So the little boy at 6 or 7 that learns that boys don't cry, we get better at the things that we practice. So if I don't practice being with my grief for 20 years, I shouldn't be surprised that at 26, I'm in a relationship and I can't be vulnerable with my partner or show any emotion. Because I'm 26, but there's a part of me that never got space to develop. That's how I think about it. The same as many things. I mean, probably a silly example, but you could be 15 and playing football for 5 years. You've got 5 years of football experience. You could be 50 and never have played football. And so the 15-year-old's got more experience than you. You know, it's how much experience do we have in different realms. And the more we were told we had to be a certain way, the more a smaller box we will put ourselves in. So there's many different aspects of being human that we just haven't got practice in. And there's a vulnerability in that, of course, because we want to be good at things. We want to be efficient. We want to see the logic behind it all. So I think that's the challenge in men's work in terms of the emotional landscape, and I've been humbled even with this, despite doing this work. Sometimes I'll work with a client who's in his 80s and we'll tap into a part of him that's like 12, that's been running his life for decades. It's like, wow. For some reason, there's a part of me that's surprised that someone's inner child is still with them every step of the way. But yeah.
So there's just parts of us that get really frozen, like you said, frozen in time, like a time capsule, the little emotional parts of us or experiential parts of us that get kind of locked in to part. And I'm going to just talk about myself here. I can see that there's a part of me around mistakes. For me, it's like making a mistake and being kind of told off. So it's like it's a part of me that still thinks I'm 6 years old and my dad's telling me off for not being able to read. Or my impression of him is him telling me off for not being able to read a particular word correctly. So wanting to hide any mistakes, but then that leads to that little part of me there. And then there's a protective part of me that's like, well, don't put yourself out in the world too much, because then people are going to see your mistakes. So then you're going to get found out. That causes me to procrastinate in my life as well with my work and various other aspects that can lead to me, even in my own relationship, maybe hiding from closeness and intimacy because, maybe I'll get something wrong. Like there's really this like multi-layered way in which the frozen parts of us or the parts of us that get suppressed or pushed into our shadow then affect the multiple areas of our lives that are really important to us.
Yeah, another piece that I think about sometimes, I wrote about it in the book, is inner child gets talked about a lot. I think inner teenager maybe doesn't get spoken about as much. And in our teens, we get kind of that sexual energy maybe, and we start to see the world differently. There's new aspects of ourselves that develop, and maybe your first sexual experiences are shameful in a certain way. And so that part becomes frozen. You have a difficult sexual experience and suddenly you develop a story around how you are. I'm not a sexual being, or I don't know what I'm doing, or whatever it might be. And that part gets frozen. And there's probably not too many of us in the world that are actively going out and having the humility to put our hand up and say, I need some support in this area, so it's same thing. So many aspects of our life. The first time we cry, the first time we get anger, the first time we had sexual relations, oftentimes the first times, how we are in group dynamics is another kind of aspect that I sometimes encourage people to explore. Like, who do you become in a group? Because sometimes we have these unconscious ways that we just show up. Sometimes people are the funny guy that breaks the tension for everyone. Some other people kind of watch back. Some people are the caretaker. And all of these are, it's not about living in your head trying to figure this stuff out all the time, but it's interesting just to notice some of your patterns. And ultimately, I think the question is this pattern supporting the man I'm looking to become? Because we've mentioned a few of our protectors already. The protectors, I think, it's really important to bless them and not to shame those parts or beat those parts up, to say, wow, up until this point in my life, this has been a genius strategy. The 6-year-old, I really love the 6-year-old boy in me who recognized that this was a way of me staying safe in the world. But now it's my turn to step in and sort of update the software, if you will, and remind him, or update the hardware, whatever analogy you want to use. This helped me, but it's that idea that what got us here won't get us there. And I think the purpose of life is around individuation, which is becoming your authentic individual self. And that requires peeling back some of these layers and asking, is this really who I am choosing to be in the world? Or is this a reaction to my youth? And some of the reactions to the youth are the stories of, I'll never be like my father, or I'll never be like my mother. And so we just flip to the opposite, which again is not authentic because it's a reaction rather than a choice. So all of this work really is about consciously choosing, like, who do I want to be in the world? Not based on my conditioning, but based on, whatever is within me.
And you mentioned a few things that I'd love to dive into, like inner teenager, the father. But I think the one I'm interested in is the inner teenager. Like you said, like there's a lot of conversations about inner child work, and people have created books and all sorts of courses and stuff about inner child work. But this inner teenager is something that I found a group of meditations on, actually, and was talking about inner teenager and adaptive child, and it's something that often gets left out of the conversation. What is the inner teenager? I know you've touched on it a bit there, and why is it so important for us to kind of delve into that?
I suppose developmentally, the way I think about it is, your first couple of years, you're shaped by your family, your community, and your culture. Those are kind of the 3 spheres of influence. So your family give you a set of rules as to who you need to be. Then your community, so your school, your sports teams, all that kind of thing. And then your culture, so the media, the religion, your gender, all these other factors kind of give you a rule book that you're not conscious of, but you start to adapt to fit within that tribe. But I think the interesting thing that kind of happens when we shift into our teens, there's a real kind of archetypical change, which you might think about, I don't know, a little girl pulling the girl band or the boy band posters off the wall and buying makeup, or the little boy, similar, maybe pulling the wrestling posters off the wall and now he's going to get his ear pierced or something. There's this kind of rebellion part almost. And I think your teens become about becoming more of an individual. Oftentimes there's a rebellion against what your parents want. There's a rebellion against society wants. There's this kind of energy that's running through you. And I guess part of the purpose of men's work is to try and foster that energy or support that energy, because when it's not supported and it doesn't have mentorship or eldership, that energy can really just be uncontained, I guess, and can be reckless and result in all sorts. And so that's the importance, I think, of mentorship for teens. But it's a time where there's sexual interest comes online more so. The kind of childish aspects of ourselves, maybe we become ashamed of, and we push those into the background. Okay, there's certain things now that a teenage boy definitely doesn't do. Definitely don't be too happy around the other boys. Definitely don't have too much fun. Definitely don't dance. Like, all these other aspects get pushed into shadow. And so, it's almost like an updated version, I guess, of who we've chosen or who we've decided we have to be in the world. That's kind of how I see it, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about freedom and rebellion, because I kind of had this same theory about, like, every person in their life must rebel. I think every person must rebel against their parents' way of living or choices. Like, and usually we do this in our teenage years. Like, we seek freedom through the way we dress, or, like you said, piercing an ear, or the way we speak. And often, it's very common for teenagers to have like quite difficult relationship with their parents. And I sometimes see in men, actually, who have never done this. They're kind of still living under their parents' like eyes, or the way their parents think they should live, or hiding the parts of themselves that are rebellious. And it kind of lead to this, like, it's a kind of nice guy element, but it's also this kind of way in which they feel, it's really hard for me to describe in words. It's like it's like they're being pushed down by their parents and still being molded. They're not allowed to be men. They're living as if they have to be living under the rule or thumb of their parents. Sometimes it's a mother, sometimes it's a father. And it's like a underactive almost kind of inner teenager that's never really gone, who I'm going to be an individual. And what does that look like in my life? But then I also see what I've seen with them is actually then there's a sexual repression often. It goes in two directions always. Either it's completely repressed and they've really not advanced into sex, or they've overindulged, but there's a hiding. So sometimes it's like porn addiction. Sometimes it's levels, not really sex addiction, but like a very active sexual life. But then there's always a hiding about it because there's still this feeling that they're not really allowed to.
Mm-hmm. There's two pieces potentially in this. The one is the idea of the midlife crisis. A friend of mine renamed it the midlife liberation. He says you get to a point where you just don't care anymore. You do whatever you want, which is nice. But another way of thinking about it is, if as a teenager, I don't have that space to individuate a little bit, to show a bit of myself, to figure out who I am, if there's none of that there and I'm kind of crowded, and then my whole life starts to be built around kind of how I'm perceived or how I'm seen. Because there's a lot of that in the teenage energy. How does the world see me? I guess that's a lot of the energy there. The child is playful and there's some innocence there and there's some just kind of presence maybe there. But I think the teenage is a real insecurity with being a teenager. At least that was for me. But if in your teenage years you start to define yourself by how you're seen, how attractive you are, how successful you are, and these kind of metrics, and you never have an internal sort of experience of yourself, you then go into the workforce, maybe you get into a relationship, and again, that part has gotten frozen in time, that never got to actually fulfill his needs. And what can happen then in the 40s or 50s is what we call the midlife crisis, is the guy leaves his partner, buys a sports car and gets a younger partner. And effectively it's the idea that it's not the 50-year-old man that's making the decisions, it's the 15-year-old boy who's making childish decisions. And I think the same could be true maybe sexually, with like, sometimes we'll project our stuff onto the screen. So with porn, if people are kind of curious about what's the type of porn I gravitate toward, I went to a therapist at one point, and he's in his 80s, and we were talking about porn a couple of years ago, and he said, "What type of porn are you watching?" I was like, I don't remember. He just looked at me, he's like, "What type of porn are you watching?" I'm like, "Oh, something." And he wasn't letting it slide, but he would basically figure out what was happening in your life based on, at least what your shadow was kind of projecting onto the screen. So if you felt disempowered in your relationship, maybe you're watching porn where the men are very dominant and it's giving you that sense of dominance through the screen, which is kind of an interesting piece as well. So yeah, same thing. It's like, what aspects that could be an inquiry maybe. What were the aspects of myself as a teenager that I didn't get to express? And rather than an unconscious midlife crisis, could I consciously bring them back out and find a practice? That could be like joining a jiu-jitsu gym if that's something you always wanted to do and you consciously choose to bring that into your life as an adult, or starting art classes, or like that's choice rather than kind of reactivity. And I think if we don't make choices in life and actually listen to these impulses, the impulses take over, and then we end up oftentimes acting them out in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, the choice. I love that, because and I'd love to get your view on this. I think as a society, we're often locked in this teenage phase of life. Like, we don't get out of this teenager phase where we're really concerned with how things look or what people think of us. And we, chasing freedom, chasing money, like all the things that we kind of believed as teenagers would give us the life that we want. And like, I don't think it's just on an individual level. I don't think it's just men. I think women have a slightly different shadow, which is really about looks. And yeah, looks is a big, part of that. But there's also this kind of like societal shadow, I think, that sits on us, of like almost like an immaturity, not just at the society level, even a world level, of like a way of being that's kind of immature, that just feels like we're, as you said, it's like teenagers running the world, So often I look at, when I do read the news, which is very infrequently these days, sometimes I look at the pictures of world leaders and I just imagine what they look like as teenagers, or what they might have experienced, like, you probably would have been 13 at school and you might have been bullied because everyone knew who your dad was, and your dad was really rich and wealthy, and everyone knew you were only in the school because of who your dad was. And you probably were a bit lame, a bit boring, not particularly sporty. And it would have been hard for you at school. And now that you're an adult, you're like wreaking revenge on the world for the way that you might have been treated when you were 13.
Yeah. I'm thinking of all the boys that own the tech companies. That's what comes to mind when you're in the. Yeah, it is. I think it is a teenage culture. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is, if we haven't done our healing work, then we're all walking around trying to protect the more vulnerable aspects of ourselves. So by proxy of that, we're showing up in our teenage parts. So I'm trying to impress you, you're trying to impress me. And those two parts trying to impress each other are never going to impress each other because they're not happy in their own skin. And so behind that, there's the parts that can actually connect, which is why in the moments of vulnerability, true connection happens. And something I share sometimes is that, you know, if we're in conflict or there's tension in some way, I can make 1,000 assumptions about your experience, about what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're perceiving, how you're trying to judge. I can make so many different assumptions. The only thing I can be sure of in that moment is the feeling I'm experiencing. And that's the very thing that I find hardest to reveal in those moments. So it's like, if I can have the vulnerability to say, I'm scared in this moment. I'm scared that you're going to think I'm a certain way. And then that opens up the door. But the other piece around the teenage culture is the idea that, like, maybe decades ago, people's lives, I think, were about the village. They talk about this. First and foremost, it was your village, so supporting your community. And then secondarily, it was your family. And then thirdly, it was yourself, the individual. And that whole thing has shifted on its head. So back then it would have been, you know, there's 100 of us in the village. Everyone's got a role. So there's a baker, there's a, I don't know, podcaster, there's a postman. Everyone's got their own role. And because everyone's got an individual role, everyone has value to bring to the village. And your life is not about yourself because you're doing something in service of the greater village. And so if someone dies in the village, then suddenly we don't have a baker anymore. And so the whole village is affected by this. So there's not the isolation maybe we have today. So it's gone from village first, then family, then individual, to now it's individual first. Sometimes people lean into their family. Very few have the village or the community beyond that. So that creates separation and isolation, which in turn, I think, creates this teenage culture where there's an insecurity. I think you're going to be insecure if you're not in connection to other people. At least that's been my experience.